The sky didn't change all at once. It changed in pieces. At first, it was just the sound. Not loud. Not violent. Not even close enough to be called approaching. Just present. A low, continuous tone, like something enormous breathing too slowly to notice itself. It pressed against the air, against the ground, against the inside of your chest in a way that made your thoughts feel slightly out of alignment. People stepped outside to look. Not because they were afraid. Because nothing in their lives had prepared them for a sound like that. The power went out 3 minutes later. Not flickering. Not failing. Gone. Entire cities dropped into silence so complete it felt artificial. Traffic lights froze. Screens died mid-sentence. Elevators stopped between floors with people inside them, phones already useless before they could even dial. And then the sky finished changing. Shapes appeared. Not descending. Not landing. Arranging. That was the word people would use later, the ones who tried to describe it in reports that nobody fully believed. The ships didn't move like vehicles. They moved like something placing itself carefully. One by one, they took positions above the atmosphere in a pattern so precise it felt intentional in a way that made human precision look like guesswork. No engines. No trails. No sound beyond that same low, steady tone. As if the sky itself had decided to hold a single note forever. On the ground, nothing fired. No missiles. No defenses. Because there was nothing to fire at. Nothing within range. Nothing behaving like a threat in any way the systems were designed to recognize. And that was the first mistake. 16 minutes after the power grid failed, the first strike happened. There was no warning. No heat signature spike. No incoming trajectory. A light. A pressure. And then the hospital in District 4 was no longer there. Not destroyed. Removed. Like something had reached down and edited it out of existence. Emergency channels tried to activate. Military networks attempted to reroute. Backup systems failed in ways they had never failed before, cleanly, completely, without resistance. Across the eastern seaboard, across cities and towns and places that had never once considered themselves part of the same moment, people stood in the dark and looked up at a sky that was no longer behaving correctly. And somewhere, in a drainage ditch filling slowly with cold water, a soldier pressed her face into the mud and tried to understand why the sound in the sky felt less like an attack, and more like something that had already decided how this was going to end. She was wrong about that, but not in the way anyone would have expected. Sergeant Layla Nadim had not slept in 32 hours. She knew that number because she had repeated it to herself every hour, like it might become less true if she kept track of it carefully enough. It hadn't. The ditch was deeper than it looked from above, which was the only reason any of them were still alive. Water pooled around her boots, cold and rising, soaking through the seams. The mud had a smell to it, earth and rot and something metallic underneath that she didn't want to think about too closely. Behind her, 7 soldiers sat in varying stages of stillness. Not resting. Not really. Just paused. Like machines that had run out of instructions but hadn't been told to shut down. Private Hamid was staring at his hands as if he'd forgotten what they were for. Corporal Ilyas had his head back against the concrete wall, eyes closed, lips moving silently through a prayer he'd lost track of halfway through. Someone farther back was shaking, small, constant tremors that never quite became visible enough to comment on. No one spoke. Talking required certainty. Or energy. They had neither. Layla adjusted her grip on the rifle resting across her knees. Half a magazine left. She had counted that too. Counted everything. Rounds. People. Hours. Numbers were stable. Numbers made sense. Everything else didn't. The radio clipped at her shoulder crackled once, then went quiet again. It had done that all morning. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it picked up fragments, voices that started mid-sentence and ended before meaning could form. All units, hold, repeat, do not. Silence. She didn't try to fix it again. There was nothing to fix. Above them, the sound continued. That low, endless tone. Closer now. Not louder, just near. Like distance didn't apply the way it was supposed to. Layla lifted her head slightly, just enough to see the edge of the sky through the broken concrete lip of the drainage channel. The ships were still there. Exactly where they had been. Not drifting. Not adjusting. Holding position with a kind of patience that felt deliberate. That was the worst part. If they had been attacking, actively, aggressively, it would have made sense. You could respond to aggression. You could move. You could fight. But this felt like being watched by something that had already decided you weren't going anywhere. Sergeant. The voice came from behind her. Quiet. Careful. She turned slightly. It was Hamid. You think command still. He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Layla looked at him for a moment. There were a dozen possible answers. None of them useful. They're still there, she said finally. It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the truth he was asking for. Hamid nodded anyway. People didn't need truth right now. They needed something that held together long enough to keep moving. Layla shifted her weight, ignoring the way her muscles protested. Listen carefully, she said, voice low but steady. Heads turned. Slowly. Reluctantly. But they turned. We move in 10 minutes, she continued. West side. There's a service road about 200 meters out. If it's still clear, we follow it to higher ground. Higher ground for what? Someone asked. Not defiant. Just tired. Layla didn't answer immediately. Because she didn't know. Because higher ground didn't mean anything against something that lived above the atmosphere. But standing still meant dying in place. And that, at least, she understood. For options, she said. It was a weak answer. It was also the only one available. No one argued. Not because they agreed. Because arguing required belief that a better option existed. Layla checked the sky one more time. Still the same. Still wrong. She had been in combat before. Border conflicts. Urban operations. Situations where things went bad quickly and stayed bad until someone forced them to stop. This wasn't that. This wasn't fast. This wasn't loud. This was something else. Something that moved at its own pace. Something that didn't need to rush. And that meant she didn't finish the thought. Didn't let herself. Because finishing it would mean accepting something she wasn't ready to accept yet. That they weren't fighting for advantage. They were fighting for time. And time, right now, didn't feel like something they had. 10 minutes, she repeated. The soldiers behind her shifted. Weapons checked. Straps tightened. Movements slow, automatic. Human. Above them, the sky held its note. Unchanging. Unconcerned. As if whatever had arrived wasn't here to win a battle, but to carry out something that had already been decided. And down in the ditch, with water rising and ammunition running low, Sergeant Layla Nadim prepared to move anyway. Because not moving was the only option she refused to consider. Substrategist Virek Tal did not experience anticipation. Anticipation implied uncertainty. Uncertainty implied incomplete data. And incomplete data, in Virek Tal's experience, was a temporary condition. From the observation chamber of the orbital command vessel Silent Accord, the planet rotated below with quiet predictability. Cloud systems moved along projected paths. Thermal signatures rose and fell within expected ranges. Surface activity, what remained of it, followed patterns his models had already accounted for. Everything was proceeding correctly. He adjusted the display with a small gesture, bringing the eastern seaboard into focus. A grid overlay appeared. Hundreds of markers. Some blinking. Most gone. The initial suppression phase had achieved a 92.6% infrastructure neutralization within the first 18 hours. Power distribution, eliminated. Communication networks, fragmented beyond functional recovery. Military coordination, reduced to localized clusters operating without central command. Efficient. Predictable. Virek Tal recorded the update without emotion. Phase 1. Complete within projected variance. He paused only briefly before opening the next sequence. Ground resistance. This part was always less precise. Not because it was difficult, but because it was unnecessary. The display shifted again, highlighting small concentrations of human forces. Scattered. Disorganized. Persistent. They moved through terrain inefficiently, abandoning optimal routes, clustering in ways that suggested emotional rather than strategic decision-making. His models adjusted in real time, recalculating, refining. Every movement fed the system. Every deviation became data. He watched a unit relocate from a compromised urban zone into a drainage network. Suboptimal. Predictable. Containment probability, 87%. He marked it for later processing. Ground forces are adapting within expected human parameters, one of his analysts reported from across the chamber. Virectal acknowledged without looking. Define. The analyst brought up a secondary display. Reduced reliance on centralized command. Increased localized decision-making. Resource conservation behaviors observed. Virectal considered this. Deviation? Within acceptable limits, the analyst replied. Comparable to pre-contact simulations. Of course it was. Humans responded to pressure the same way most species did. They fragmented. They conserved. They attempted to survive long enough for structure to re-emerge. It was not a failure of their design. It was a limitation of it. Virectal expanded the engagement timeline. 72 hours. That was the window. By then, organized resistance would collapse entirely. Remaining forces would transition into non-coordinated survival patterns. From there, the process became administrative. He opened the occupation draft. 3 sections. Military status. Infrastructure assessment. Projected timeline. He had written versions of this document before. Different planets. Different species. The structure never changed. Because the outcome never did. Orbital strike sequence ready, another voice reported. Virectal shifted focus. Target grid illuminated. No dramatic indicators. No escalating alerts. Just quiet confirmation. He selected the next target. A ridge formation supporting a cluster of resistance signals. Minimal strategic value, but necessary for pattern completion. Execute, he said. There was no visible projectile. No launch sequence. No movement at all. A brief increase in energy output. A distortion in the atmosphere. And then the ridge was no longer a ridge. Topography updated instantly. Elevation, 0. Resistance signals, removed. Virectal noted the result. Precise. Measured. Correct. He did not experience satisfaction. Satisfaction implied effort. This required none. Across the chamber, data continued to flow. Supply routes stabilized. Orbital positions maintained. Civilian movement restricted to designated zones. All variables aligned with predictive models. Any anomalies? He asked. There was a brief pause. Not long, but long enough to register. One minor disruption in the Western logistics chain, the analyst said. Virectal turned his attention. Cause? Under review. He waited. Because waiting, unlike anticipation, did not require uncertainty. It required time. And time, in this operation, belonged entirely to him. The report updated. He read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Impact caused by civilian-grade transport vehicle. Navigation interference misidentification. Relay structure compromised. He stopped reading. Not because he did not understand. Because understanding, in this instance, was incomplete. It was accidental? He asked. Yes. No hostile intent? None detected. Virectal studied the data. The supply relay, part of a synchronized guidance network, had been destroyed. Not by a weapon. Not by a coordinated strike. But by a human vehicle that had simply failed to recognize it. That was not unusual. Humans made errors. Their perception was limited. Their systems were imprecise. What was unusual was the effect. The disruption had propagated. One failure cascading into multiple. Supply delays. Routing inefficiencies. Temporary gaps in logistical coverage. Nothing critical. Nothing permanent. But not predicted. Virectal opened a new section in his report. He labeled it Addendum, Minor Irregularities. He began to write. Then stopped. Because the language did not fit. Because the system did not contain a category for what had occurred. Not properly. He closed the document. Recalculate impact, he said. The system complied. Numbers adjusted. Timelines shifted slightly. Insignificant. Everything remained within acceptable parameters. Of course it did. It always did. Virectal looked back at the planet. At the scattered human signals. At the slow, predictable collapse of organized resistance. There was no threat here. No real one. Just a species behaving exactly as it was expected to behave. And yet, he paused. Only for a moment. Only because the data required it. Something had happened. Not significant. Not yet. But misaligned. He dismissed the thought. Because misalignment, like uncertainty, was temporary. The system would correct. It always corrected. Below him, on the surface of a planet that was already categorized, already solved, already moving toward its inevitable conclusion, a group of exhausted soldiers prepared to move through a drainage ditch with half their ammunition gone. And somewhere in the expanding network of calculations and predictions that defined the campaign, that movement had already been accounted for. Or so the system believed. Corporal Samir Qureshi had driven this road more times than he could remember, which was exactly why he didn't question it. The truck was old. Not broken, just worn in the way machines get when they've done their job for too long without anyone thanking them for it. The engine rattled slightly above idle, the steering pulled a little to the left, and the windshield wiper only worked on one speed, which was too fast for light rain and too slow for heavy. Right now, it smeared a thin layer of dust across the glass in uneven arcs. Samir leaned forward slightly, squinting. The world had lost its edges. Without power, without traffic systems, without the background noise of a functioning civilization, everything felt flatter, quieter, wrong. His orders had been simple. Take the fuel truck from the secondary depot to the forward command position. 40 minutes. Maybe less if the road stayed clear. The road had always stayed clear. That was the problem. Up ahead, the highway stretched out in a long, uninterrupted line. Except, it wasn't uninterrupted anymore. Something stood in the middle of it. So narrow, glowing faintly blue. Samir frowned. For a moment, it didn't register as an obstacle. Looked like part of the road. The same color. The same reflective sheen. Like light caught on wet asphalt. He slowed slightly, but not enough. His brain tried to process it. Tried to categorize it. But not road. Reflection. Marker. Continuation. The wiper dragged across the glass again, distorting the shape just enough to make it seem familiar. He made a decision. Not consciously. Not deliberately. The kind of decision people make 1,000 times a day without noticing. He kept driving. The truck hit the structure at full speed. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the world turned blue. Light, pure, overwhelming, directionless, filled the cab, the road, the air itself. The sound came a moment later. Not an explosion in the way Samir understood explosions. More like reality snapping. The relay tower shattered. Not outward, but through. Energy cascaded along invisible lines, jumping from node to node in a chain reaction that had never been designed to handle interruption. The truck didn't stop. It punched through the base structure, through the housing behind it, through something that disintegrated into fragments of light and metal and data that no longer had anywhere to go. Samir's hand stayed on the wheel. His foot stayed on the accelerator. Because his body hadn't caught up yet. Because stopping required understanding what had just happened. And he didn't. The truck rolled forward another 30 meters before the engine coughed once and died. Silence followed. Immediate. Total. Samir blinked. Looked down at himself. He was still there. Hands. Arms. Breathing. Alive. There was something on his jacket. Blue. Glowing faintly. He touched it. It smeared. Liquid. He stared at it for a moment. Then slowly looked up. The road behind him was gone. Not physically, but functionally. Where the relay had stood, there was now a widening gap in something he couldn't see, but could feel. like a structure had been removed from reality's scaffolding. The air felt disconnected. His radio crackled. Twice. Forward units, routing failure, repeat, routing failure. Samir swallowed, pressed the transmit button with a hand that was only just beginning to shake. Command, this is Corporal Qureshi, he said. He paused, because there was no category for what had just happened. No training, no protocol. Just a man in a broken truck, covered in something that glowed, sitting in the middle of a road that no longer behaved correctly. I think, he said carefully, I broke something important. On the orbital command vessel, the update arrived in silence. Virektal read it once, then again, then a third time. Not because the words were unclear, because the implications were. Explain, he said. The analyst hesitated, not out of fear, out of lack of precision. The relay network experienced a cascading failure, the analyst said. Primary node destruction propagated through secondary systems. Cause? A ground vehicle. Virektal waited, because that was not an answer. That is not a cause, he said. It is the recorded event, the analyst replied. Silence stretched across the chamber. Virektal pulled up the sensor feed. He watched the sequence. The vehicle. The approach. The lack of deviation. No targeting. No intent. No awareness. Movement. Disruption. He replayed it. And again. Looking for pattern. Looking for design. There was none. It was random. That word did not exist in his operational framework. Not truly. Everything had cause. Everything had structure. Even error followed predictable boundaries. This did not. He opened his report, scrolled to the addendum, placed the cursor at the end of the last line, and found that, for the first time in his career, he did not know what to write. 300 kilometers away, Sergeant Layla Nadim heard the transmission come through in fragments. Supply routes, compromised. Manual navigation required. Delay, 72 hours minimum. She lowered the radio slowly, looked at the soldiers around her, at the empty road, at the sky that still held its quiet, patient note. They were cut off. No supplies. No support. No structure. What they had. What they could carry. What they could find. Layla exhaled once. Slowly. Then stood. Change of plan, she said. They looked at her. Waiting. Not for certainty. Just for direction. She turned her head slightly, toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. Industrial. Concrete. Intact. For now. Layla exhaled once. Slowly. Then stood. Change of plan, she said. They looked at her. Waiting. Not for certainty. Just for direction. She turned her head slightly, toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. Industrial. Concrete. Intact. For now. We're not moving to higher ground, she said. We're moving there. What's there? Someone asked. Layla looked at the buildings. At the unknown. At the absence of options. Then back at her team. I don't know, she said. And for the first time, there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Not fear. Not exactly. Something sharper. More focused. We're going to find out. Above them, in orbit, the system recalculated. Timelines adjusted. Variables shifted. Everything remained within acceptable parameters. But somewhere, deep inside a structure built on prediction, a question had formed. Undefined. Unresolved. And on the surface of a planet that had already been categorized, already been measured, already been deemed predictable. A man had driven into something he did not understand, and changed the shape of the war. Without meaning to. The building had once been a grain processing facility. You could tell from the smell. Even before they got close. Dry, old, settled into the walls and the floors and the air itself. The kind of place built to last decades without anyone thinking too hard about it. Concrete thick enough to ignore weather. Windows small enough to discourage curiosity. Function over form. It was still standing. That was enough. Layla moved first. Across the open stretch between the road and the facility, boots hitting gravel too loud in the quiet. The others followed without needing to be told. They moved like people who had run out of time for hesitation. Inside, the temperature dropped. The air was cooler. Still safe, in the limited way anything could be called safe now. Clear, Ilias called from the far side of the main floor. Clear, someone echoed from above. No bodies. No damage beyond a partial collapse in the roof where something had hit days ago. Not destroyed. Ignored. Layla noticed that. Didn't think about it yet. Just filed it away. Doors, she said. Seal what you can. They moved. Slowly at first. Then faster as routine took over. Barricades. Sight lines. Entry points. Human things. Things they understood. Things that still made sense. Layla walked past the main processing area toward a side corridor. The maintenance room. She didn't know why she chose it. Maybe because it was smaller. Contained. Maybe because that was where things were kept. Not food. Not supplies. Tools. She stepped inside. And stopped. Shelves. Rows of them. Lined with objects that had nothing to do with war. Lengths of metal stacked in bundles. Coils of wire. Boxes of fittings. Welding equipment bolted to a workbench. Containers labeled with chemical markings she didn't immediately recognize. It wasn't useful. Not in the way she needed. No weapons. No ammunition. No communications. Stuff. Behind her, footsteps. Private Hamid. Sergeant. She didn't answer. She stepped further into the room. Ran her hand along a length of pipe. Cold. Solid. Heavy. Her mind tried to move past it. To dismiss it. Not relevant. Not helpful. But something caught. She stopped. Turned the pipe over in her hands. Looked at the shelves again. Not as a soldier. Not as someone searching for equipment. But as something else. Something quieter. More primitive. What are we doing? Hamid asked. Layla didn't look at him. She was staring at the objects. At all of it. The pipes. The wires. The containers. The tools. Things that existed for reasons that no longer mattered. Things that had been designed for one purpose, and were now just available. Her grip on the pipe tightened slightly. We're, she said slowly, not dead yet. Hamid blinked. That wasn't an answer. It also wasn't wrong. Layla set the pipe down. Picked up a smaller one. Tested the weight. Looked at the welding equipment. Looked at the containers again. Her brain was doing something. Not consciously. Not fully formed. Connecting. Pieces. Possibilities. Wrong ideas. Bad ideas. Ideas that didn't make sense. And then, she exhaled once. Decisive. We're going to build something, she said. Hamid stared at her. With what? Layla gestured at the room. With what's here? That's not, he stopped himself. Because it didn't matter what it wasn't. Because nothing else was. She turned to face him now. Eyes clearer than they had been in hours. Focused in a way that hadn't been there before. Get everyone in here, she said. Now. It took 4 hours. None of them agreed on anything. Not at first. This won't hold. The pressure will blow back. We don't have the right. We don't have anything else. That ended most arguments. They worked anyway. Because working was better than waiting. Because waiting felt like dying slowly. Because doing something, even something wrong, felt like movement. Layla directed without realizing she was doing it. Not giving orders. Asking questions. What happens if we cap this end? What happens if we reduce the diameter? What happens if we ignite it here instead of here? No one had the answers. So they guessed. Tested. Adjusted. Improvised. The pipe became something else. Not clean. Not precise. Not anything an engineer would recognize as acceptable. A sleeve hammered into place to narrow the bore. A firing mechanism built from a pressure valve ripped from the irrigation system. A bipod welded together from bent support rods. Hooked. Wrong. Like an object that had been forced into being something it didn't want to be. Propellant? Ilias asked. Silence. One of the younger soldiers stepped forward. Amina. I grew up on a farm, she said. Everyone looked at her. She pointed at the containers. Fertilizer, she said. Then at another set. Pest control compounds. Layla tilted her head slightly. You know what happens if we mix those? Amina hesitated. Not exactly. Close enough. Layla asked. Amina thought about it. Then nodded once. Close enough. The first test was outside. Against the silo wall. Everyone stood back. Further than they thought they needed to. Just in case. Layla adjusted the angle. Not based on calculation. Based on instinct. Ready, she said. No one answered. That counted. She triggered it. The sound was wrong. Too deep. Too heavy. The recoil nearly tore the makeshift mount apart. The round slammed into the concrete wall. And left a crater the size of a human torso. Silence followed. Not shock. Not disbelief. Something else. Recognition. That's too much, Ilyas said quietly. Layla stared at the crater. At the damage. At the result. Then shook her head once. No, she said. That's enough. They carried it to the roof. Carefully. Because it felt like it might fall apart at any moment. Because it probably would. Layla set it down near the edge. Looked out. The road stretched below. Empty. Movement. A convoy. For vehicles. Alien. Precise spacing. Perfect alignment. Moving without urgency. Because they didn't need to. Because nothing had threatened them yet. Layla looked at the weapon. Then at the convoy. Then back at the weapon. This is stupid, Hamid muttered. Layla didn't disagree. She adjusted the angle. Distance, she asked. Amina squinted. Estimated. 3 kilometers, she said. Maybe a little more. Angle. Amina hesitated. 30 degrees. Layla almost smiled. Maybe, she said. She fired. The round arced. Too far. It landed off the road. But close enough. One of the vehicles swerved. Not out of fear. Out of correction. Out of something that hadn't happened before. The convoy stopped. For the first time. They reacted. Adjust, Layla said. Amina adjusted. 32. The metal creaked. The weld strained. None of it mattered. Second shot. Direct hit. The lead vehicle disappeared in a burst of light and fragmentation that was entirely disproportionate to what had just been fired. The explosion expanded. Too large. Too violent. Something inside the vehicle had amplified it. Layla saw that. Registered it. Stored it. Third shot. The convoy broke formation. Not cleanly. Not precisely. Messily. Confused. Like something that had never needed to adapt suddenly being forced to. Move, Layla said. No hesitation this time. They grabbed the weapon. Down the stairs. Through the building. Out into the back. Because they knew. They had seconds. Behind them. The sky answered. In orbit, Virectal watched the replay. Twice. 3 vehicles destroyed. 1 disabled. But he zoomed in. Enhanced the image. Filtered the data. The pipe. Agricultural-grade material. A chemical mixture with no standardized composition. A delivery mechanism that did not exist in any military database. He sat very still. Because movement, in this moment, would imply reaction. And reaction implied understanding. He did not have that. He opened the report. Scrolled to the addendum. And began to write. Then stopped. Because the words, so, did not exist. Below him, in the dark of a basement filled with dust and exhaustion and something new, Layla leaned against the wall. Breathing hard. Hands shaking. Across from her, the weapon rested. Damaged. Functional. We built that, Hamid said. Not proud. Not afraid. Trying to understand it. Layla nodded once. We did. She looked at it. Then at the room. Then at the shelves. And something shifted. Not in the war. Not yet. But in her. A question forming. Clearer now. Stronger. What do we have? But what can this become? They didn't stop running until the ground stopped shaking. Even then, no one spoke. The basement held. That was the first thing that mattered. Concrete thick enough. Foundation deep enough. The structure above them had taken the strike. The roof, the upper floor, the place where they had stood minutes earlier, and turned it into falling debris and dust. But down here they were still alive. For now. Layla leaned forward, hands on her knees, breathing in short, controlled bursts. Not panic. Just recovery. Around her, the others did the same. Counting breaths. Rebuilding rhythm. Human systems resetting themselves without needing permission. Above them, something shifted. The sound in the sky. Not louder. Not closer. Sharper. As if attention had moved. As if something that had been observing broadly was now focusing. Hamid noticed it first. "They know," he said quietly. No one asked what he meant. They all understood. The strike had been fast. Precise. Not retaliation in anger. Correction. Like adjusting a variable that had behaved unexpectedly. Layla straightened slowly. Looked around the room. 14 people. Still 14. That mattered. It mattered more than it should have. She let herself feel that for exactly 1 second. Then she moved on. "Status," she said. Voices answered. One by one. "Minor burns. Bruised ribs. Good. Good. All good." No one said what they were all thinking. That good didn't mean safe. It meant functioning. And functioning was enough. For now. Layla turned her attention to the weapon. It lay against the wall. Bent slightly at the mount. Scorched along the chamber. The bipod uneven where the weld had taken more stress than it was ever meant to. It looked worse than before. Which meant it had worked. She stepped toward it. Ran her fingers along the metal. Still warm. Still holding together. Barely. "How many more shots?" Ilyas asked. Layla didn't answer immediately. Because this wasn't a question with a number. It was a question about limits. About thresholds. About how far something could be pushed before it stopped being useful. She looked up. Met his eyes. "As many as it gives us," she said. He nodded. Because that was the only answer that mattered. Above them, the sky adjusted again. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But something had changed. The ships maintained their positions. The pattern remained perfect. But the behavior within that pattern shifted. Scanning intensified. Targeting cycles shortened. Observation narrowed. For the first time, the system was not just executing. It was reacting. In orbit, Virek Tal did not move. He did not speak. He watched. Because watching was the only action that still made sense. The data did not align. The outcome did not fit. The classification did not exist. He replayed the impact sequence again. Slowed it. Analyzed the frame where the projectile made contact. A spike. Secondary energy release. Not from the weapon. From the target. The human device had not destroyed the vehicle alone. It had triggered something inside it. A chain reaction. An interaction the shielding was not designed to prevent. Because it was not designed to recognize it. Virek Tal leaned slightly closer to the display. Not out of curiosity. Out of necessity. "Identify weapon system," he said. Silence. Unable to classify. That response had never been returned before. Not once. "Refine parameters," he said. "We have," the analyst replied. "It does not fit any known category." Virek Tal considered that. Because categories were the foundation of understanding. Everything had one. Everything fit somewhere. Even unknowns had boundaries. Did not. "It is not a weapon," the analyst added carefully. Virek Tal turned his head. "Explain." "It is composed of non-military materials," the analyst said. "Agricultural piping. Chemical compounds not designed for combustion at this scale. Structural assembly inconsistent with engineered design." Virek Tal looked back at the display. At the crater. At the destroyed vehicle. At the absence of explanation. "Then why," he said slowly, "did it function as one?" No one answered. Because the system had no language for that question. On the ground, the realization came differently. Less analytical. More immediate. Hamid sat back against the wall, staring at his hands again. But this time, not in confusion. In recognition. We hit them, he said. Softly. Like testing the idea. We actually hit them. Amina laughed once. Not humor. Release. They didn't like that, she said. No one smiled. Because this wasn't victory. Not really. This was something else. Layla stood, walked to the far side of the room, looked up at the ceiling, at the structure above them, at the layers of concrete that had held, then back at the weapon, at the shelves, at everything around them, and the thought, the same one, returned. Stronger now. Clear. They weren't just surviving. They had done something. Something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Something the enemy hadn't prepared for. Not because it was powerful, because it didn't make sense. She exhaled slowly, turned back to the group. They're going to come back, she said. No hesitation. No doubt. They're going to look for us. Then we move, Ilyas said. Layla shook her head. Not yet. He frowned. Why? She gestured at the weapon. Because we're not done with this. Silence followed. Not disagreement. Consideration. Hamid looked at her. You think we can do that again? Layla met his eyes. Held it. We don't have to do it the same way, she said. And that was the moment it changed. Not the explosion. Not the destroyed vehicles. Not the strike from above. That had all been reaction. This was intention. Above them, the system updated. New parameters introduced. New variables flagged. Not as threats. Not yet. Irregularities. Minor. Containable. Correctable. But for the first time, the model did not close cleanly. In the basement, 14 exhausted humans sat in the dark beside a broken weapon they had built from things that were never meant to matter, and began, without realizing it, to think differently. Not about survival. Not about escape. But about possibility. Next time, Amina said quietly, we adjust the mixture. Hamid looked at the barrel. The angle too. Ilyas nodded. Stabilize the base. Layla listened. Didn't interrupt. Because this was the real change. Not the weapon. The thinking. The shift from, can we survive this? To, what can we do with this? She picked up a piece of metal from the floor. Turned it over in her hand. Looked at it not as scrap, but as something unfinished. Something waiting. We're not done, she said. And for the first time since the sky had changed, it didn't sound like defiance. It sounded like fact. The analysis chamber had been designed for clarity. Everything in it reflected that purpose. White surfaces. Even lighting. Displays arranged in perfect symmetry. No unnecessary objects. No distractions. Because understanding required order. And order required control. Chief Analyst Sareth Val stood in the center of the room, looking at something that did not belong in it. It sat on the examination table. Under controlled lighting. Scanned from 12 angles. Broken down into component layers. Cataloged. Measured. Labeled. Still not understood. It's a pipe, one of the junior analysts said. Sareth did not respond immediately, because that statement was both correct and completely useless. Yes, she said finally. It is. The object on the table was roughly 1.5 meters long. Industrial-grade metal. Surface irregular. Heat distortion visible along the interior. Weld points inconsistent. Structural integrity unreliable. By every known standard, it was not a weapon. It lacked precision. Lacked design uniformity. Lacked intent. And yet, it had destroyed 3 armored vehicles. Sareth turned her attention to the adjacent display. 17 more objects. All similar. All different. Variations. Pipe diameter. Material composition. Firing mechanism. Propellant mixture. Each one constructed from whatever had been available at the location it was found. None identical. None repeatable. None classifiable. We have attempted cross-referencing, another analyst said. No consistent pattern. Sarith nodded once. Of course there wasn't. Patterns required standardization. This was not standardized. This was... She paused, because the word she needed did not exist in her language. Variance, she said instead. The closest approximation. It is not variance, the junior analyst said carefully. Sarith looked at him. Explain. Variance implies deviation from a standard, he said. There is no standard. Silence followed. Because that was the problem. She moved to the next table. This one held a different object. Smaller. Handheld. Originally designed for livestock control. A tool. Modified beyond recognition. Components replaced. Wiring rerouted. Power output. Impossible. We tested it, the technician said quietly. Sarith didn't look at him. Result. It disabled a scanning unit. How long? The technician hesitated. Permanently. Sarith turned slowly. That is not possible. The technician swallowed. It happened. She looked back at the device. At the wires. At the mismatched components. At the absence of logic. Or rather, the presence of a logic she could not map. Table 3. A vehicle. Agricultural. 9,000 kilograms of civilian machinery. Reinforced with scrap metal. Mounted with a cannon constructed from water piping. Effective range. Unknown. Recorded impact. Severe. Damage to aerial unit. Confirmed. Sarith stood in front of it for a long time. What is this? She said quietly. No one answered. Because the question itself was wrong. Not because it lacked clarity. Because it assumed something that was no longer true. That objects had fixed identities. That purpose was stable. That a thing was what it was designed to be. She turned back to the main display. Activated the classification matrix. 300 years of compiled knowledge. Every weapon system ever encountered. Organized. Structured. Understandable. She gestured toward it. This system functions under 3 assumptions, she said. Her voice was calm. Controlled. Precise. The first, that a weapon has a defined purpose. The second, that it is constructed using consistent materials. The third, that once identified, it can be countered. She paused. Then gestured toward the tables. These objects violate all 3. The room was quiet. Not confused. Not questioning. Processing. Slowly. Carefully. Like something trying to reorganize itself. A senior technician raised his hand. Can we develop a countermeasure? Sarith looked at him. For a moment, she almost answered automatically. Of course. That was the function of her role. Identify. Classify. Counter. But she stopped. Because the answer did not exist. A countermeasure to what? She asked. He hesitated. The weapon. She shook her head. That is not the correct question. She stepped closer to the display. Zoomed in on the variance. On the differences. On the complete lack of consistency. The object is not the weapon, she said. Silence deepened. Because something had just shifted. Subtly. Irreversibly. She turned back to them. The weapon is the process. No one moved. Because that was not something they had ever been trained to understand. She continued. They are not manufacturing weapons, she said. They are constructing them in real time. From whatever is available. The junior analyst spoke again. Then we identify all potential materials. Sarith looked at him. How many objects exist on the surface of this planet? He didn't answer. Because the answer was meaningless. Even if we could catalog them, she continued, we would still fail. Because the selection is not predetermined. They do not know what they will build. Until they need it. The words settled into the room. Heavy. Uncomfortable. On the central display, she pulled up a simulation. A human unit. Cutoff. No weapons. No support. Standard prediction. Defensive posture. Low mobility. Eventual collapse. She replaced the model with real data. Same conditions. Different outcome. Improvised construction. Immediate adaptation. Offensive capability restored. Not by design, but response. She stared at the screen. Because this was the core failure. Not of intelligence. Not of data. Of assumption. We cannot predict this, she said. Her voice had changed slightly. Not weaker. Not uncertain. But different. We cannot build doctrine against it. We cannot classify it. We cannot limit it. She looked around the room. At the analysts. At the systems. At everything that had always worked. And was now insufficient. The process is not bounded, she said. It will go as low as it needs to. It will use whatever is present. It will adapt faster than we can model. A long silence followed. But what do we do? Someone asked. Sareth held that question. Turned it over. Analyzed it. And for the first time in her career, she did not translate it into a solution. She answered it directly. I don't know. Far above, in the command chamber, Virek Tal read her report. He reached the final section. Read the sentence. Read it again. We cannot develop a counter-doctrine for a cognitive process. He sat back slightly. Not in surprise. In recognition. Because something he had felt, without naming, now had form. The system was incomplete. On the ground, Layla didn't know any of this. She didn't know about the reports, or the analysis, or the failure of classification systems built over centuries. She only knew the pipe had worked, and the next one would be better. She stood in the maintenance room again, looking at the shelves, at the materials, at the possibilities, not searching anymore, seeing differently. What else is here? She asked. No one answered, because this time, it wasn't a question. It was a way of thinking. Above them, for the first time since the ships had arrived, the war was no longer predictable. The report was not supposed to be personal. Sareth Vall had written thousands of analyses in her career, all of them precise, all of them structured, all of them complete. This one was not. She sat alone in the chamber long after the others had left. The displays dimmed, the tables cleared, the objects removed for storage and further study. Only the central screen remained, and the document, open, unfinished. She had rewritten the final section 6 times. Each version more accurate, each version less sufficient, because accuracy, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as truth. She stared at the line she had written. The process is the weapon. It was correct. It was also incomplete, because it described what was happening, not why. She stood, walked slowly to the empty table where the pipe had been, placed her hand where it had rested, not touching it, but remembering it. A thing that was not a weapon. A thing that had never been intended to be one. The thing that had become one. Not because of its design, because of the mind that held it. She returned to the display, deleted the last paragraph, and began again. In all previous engagements, opposing forces have operated within definable boundaries. Their weapons were constructed, classified, and deployed within systems that could be observed and understood. Even when unknown, those systems followed rules. They were finite. She paused, then continued. The human response does not follow this pattern. This is not a failure of discipline. It is not a breakdown of structure. It is something else. Her hand hovered over the console for a moment. She wrote the part she had been avoiding. Humans do not require a system to produce weapons. They require only a situation. The words sat there. Uncomfortable. Unavoidable. She kept going. When deprived of tools, they do not wait for replacement. They do not withdraw to preserve function. They look at what remains. And they ask a question. She stopped again. Because this was the center. The thing everything else revolved around. She spoke it out loud. Quietly. As if testing it. What can this do that it was not designed to do? The room did not answer. It didn't need to. She wrote it. They ask, what can this do that it was not designed to do? And then they attempt to make that answer real. She leaned back slightly, looked at the sentence, then added, this is not trained behavior. It is not limited to military personnel. It is not dependent on resources or preparation. It appears to be a reflex. She hesitated, then finished it. A cognitive reflex. Silence settled around her. Not empty, because the shape of the problem was now visible. On the display, she brought up the sequence. The pipe. The vehicle. The explosion. Frame by frame. She watched the moment of impact. The interaction. The unintended consequence that had become a result. They didn't know this would happen, she said quietly. They couldn't have. Which meant they didn't need to. She turned back to the document. The effectiveness of these systems does not derive from their design. It derives from iteration. Rapid. Unstructured. Immediate. Each attempt informs the next. Each failure is data. Each success is amplified. She paused. Then added the part that mattered most. The process cannot be interrupted. Because it is not centralized. It is not commanded. It is not controlled. It occurs wherever a human is present. She stared at that line. Because that was the point of no return. To prevent it, one would need to eliminate not their weapons, but their ability to think in this way. Her hand slowed. Because she knew what came next. And once written, it could not be taken back. This is not feasible. She exhaled slowly, looked at the screen, at the shape of the conclusion forming in front of her, then finished it. Therefore, the accurate classification of this threat is not a weapons system. It is a mode of cognition. The room felt different, not changed, revealed. Far above, Virectal received the updated report. He read it once, then again, slower the second time, because the words required it, because they did not fit easily into the structure he had built his understanding on. A mode of cognition. He repeated it, not as a question, as an adjustment. The system updated, not cleanly, not completely, but it shifted. He looked down at the planet, at the scattered signals, at the areas where resistance should have collapsed, but hadn't, at the places where nothing should have been happening, but something was. Repeatedly, unpredictably, continuously. He understood now, not what they would do next, but why he could not know. On the ground, Layla stood in the same room, looking at the same shelves, holding a different piece of metal, turning it over in her hands, not thinking in words, not forming theories, but seeing connections, possibilities, uses, wrong ones, better ones, next ones. What if we mount it differently? Amina said behind her. What if we split the chamber? Ilyas added. What if we don't fire it? Hamid said slowly. What if we trigger it another way? Layla listened. Not directing. Not leading. But part of it. The process. Unstructured. Immediate. Alive. She set the metal down. Picked up something else. Didn't know what it would become. Didn't need to. In orbit, the system recalculated again. Not for victory. Not for efficiency. For possibility. And for the first time, it could not find the limits. Seraph added the final line. The one she had resisted. The one that made everything else. The threat is not what they build. It is that they will always build something. She saved the report and sat very still. Because understanding something completely sometimes meant realizing you had no control over it at all. Below her, in a damaged building filled with tools that had never been meant to matter, 14 humans prepared to build something else. And none of them, not one, could have explained why they were about to try. But they would. Every time. Director Armin Hale did not come from the military. That was intentional. He stood in the center of what had once been a logistics warehouse and was now something else entirely, holding a tablet filled with reports that did not belong together. Field notes. Audio fragments. Handwritten sketches. Half-coherent descriptions of devices that should not have worked. And yet, he had read them all. 3 times. Not because he understood them. Because he was trying to find the pattern. At first, there didn't seem to be one. A pipe in one region. A modified generator in another. A vehicle rebuilt into something unrecognizable. Different materials. Different methods. Different people. Different outcomes. It looked like chaos. Until he stopped looking at what they built and started looking at how they built it. That was when it changed. "Show me the timelines again," he said. Across the room, screens lit up. Events mapped out. Not geographically. Chronologically. That mattered more. For hours. 6 hours. Sometimes less. That was the window. From problem to solution. From nothing to something that worked. Not perfectly. Not consistently. But enough. Always enough. Hale zoomed in on one report. A unit cut off from supply. No weapons. No support. Within 3 hours, they had built a functioning projectile system. Not the same as Layla's. Not even similar. But equivalent. Different path. Same result. "That's not coincidence," someone said behind him. Hale nodded. "No," he said. "It's a method." The room went quiet. Because that word changed everything. Turned. Faced the small group gathered around him. Not soldiers. Engineers. Technicians. Civilians pulled from places that had nothing to do with war. People who understood systems. But more importantly, people who understood how systems break. "We're looking at this wrong," Hale said. "They're not improvising." The pause. Because that contradicted everything. "Yes, they are," someone said. Hale shook his head. "No," he said. "Improvisation implies randomness. This isn't random." He gestured to the screens. To the timelines. To the consistency hidden inside the inconsistency. "This is repeatable." That was the moment the room shifted. Not emotionally. Structurally. Because if something is repeatable, it can be taught. Hale moved to the central board. Picked up a marker. Drew 4 lines. Simple. No decoration. "Every report follows this," he said. He tapped the first line. Assessment. What's available? Not names. Not intended use. Properties. Density. Energy potential. Function. Unfiltered. Second line. Mapping. What roles are needed? Projectile. Propellant. Delivery. Trigger. What is this? But what can this do? Third line. Construction. Not perfect. Not optimized. Functional. Immediate. Good enough. Fourth line. Iteration. Adjust. Repeat. Until it works. He stepped back. Looked at it. Then at them. "That's it," he said. Silence. Because it was too simple. Too incomplete. Too correct. "You're saying we formalize this?" one of the engineers asked. Hale nodded. "Yes." Another voice. "You can't standardize improvisation." Hale smiled slightly. "No," he said. "You don't standardize the result. You standardize the thinking." That line landed heavy. Because it reframed everything. They worked for 2 days. No breaks that mattered. No schedule that held. Refinement. Translation. Taking something instinctive and making it visible. Not to control it. To spread it. They gave it a name. Not because it needed one. Because names travel. Names stick. Names make things real. CROW. Continuously repurposed operational workflow. Someone suggested it. No one argued. Because it fit. Crows used what they found. Turned it into something else. Something useful. The document was 12 pages. That was deliberate. Long enough to matter. Short enough to use. It didn't describe weapons. It described perspective. Page 1. See everything as material. Not objects. Not tools. Material. Page 2. Define function, not form. What does it need to do? Not what is it. Page 3. Combine without permission. If it's, use it. If it doesn't, make it. Page 4. Test immediately. Failure is data. Delay is death. Examples. Scenarios. Possibilities. Not instructions. Because instructions limit. Needed to expand. Hale read it once more. Then sent it. Every unit. Every outpost. Every place where someone was looking at a problem and didn't have the right tools. The response came faster than expected. Within hours. Reports. Images. Messages. Not requests. Results. We tried the framework. It works. We built something. Not sure what to call it. It worked. Hale stood in the middle of the room as the data came in faster than it could be organized. He didn't try to control it. Didn't try to categorize it. Because that would miss the point. He had not created something new. He had recognized something that was already happening. Given it language. Given it permission. And permission was enough. On the ground, Layla received the document through a broken transmission. Fragments at first. But enough. She read it once. Then again. Slowly. Not because it was complicated. Because it was familiar. We've been doing this, Hamid said. Layla nodded. Yes. Amina smiled faintly. Now we know how. Layla folded the paper. Set it down. Looked at the room. At the shelves. At the materials. At the weapon they had already built. And the ones they hadn't yet. Start again, she said. Above them, in orbit, the system updated. New behaviors. New patterns. New data. But the model still did not close. Because what had once been isolated was now everywhere. And there was no longer a single point to target. No central system to disrupt. No supply chain to sever. People. Looking at what was around them. And building. Virek Tal stood in the command chamber. Watching the map. Blue markers. Multiplying. Not in number. In behavior. They moved differently now. Acted differently. Engaged in ways that had no precedent. What are they building? Someone asked. Virek Tal did not answer. Because the question no longer made sense. He looked at the data. At the inconsistency. At the pattern hidden inside it. Then said quietly, they're not building weapons. The pause. They're building solutions. And that was worse. Because solutions didn't stop. The ceasefire was not announced as a victory. There were no celebrations. No speeches about triumph. No declarations of dominance. A message. Precise. Carefully worded. And sent from a command structure that, until recently, had not considered the possibility of needing one. Virek Tal stood alone in the observation chamber when the transmission was finalized. He had reviewed it 3 times. Not for accuracy. For certainty. Because certainty was no longer something he trusted easily. Confirm transmission, his aide said. Virek Tal didn't respond immediately. He was looking at the planet. At the surface patterns. At the movement that no longer aligned with any predictive model he had ever relied on. They were still winning. By every measurable metric. Territory. Resources. Position. All in their favor. And yet, he had requested the ceasefire. Confirm, he said. The message was sent. It traveled across the void. Through systems designed for war. Carrying something that had not been part of the plan. On the receiving end, Director Armin Hale read it once. Then again. Not surprised. Not relieved. Acknowledging something that had already become clear. They can't solve us, someone said behind him. Hale shook his head. That's not it, he replied. They can't predict us. The pause. Then he added quietly. And that's worse. The negotiations took place in silence. Not literal silence. But the kind where both sides understood something fundamental had shifted. Virek Tal met the human delegation without expectation. Because expectation implied understanding. And he had learned that understanding, in this case, had limits. Across the table sat Ambassador Karim Sadiq. He did not look like a man representing a force that had disrupted an entire campaign. To ordinary, tired, the kind of person you would not notice in a crowded room. That unsettled Virek Tal more than anything else. They spoke. Terms were exchanged. Boundaries discussed. Conditions outlined. All of it standard, recognizable, predictable. One clause. Cessation of non-standard adaptive weapon systems. The wording was careful. Precise. defined by the only language the Dominion had been able to construct around the problem. Kareem read it, then looked up. "You can't have that," he said. "No hesitation. No negotiation." Perfect. Virectal studied him. "You are capable of issuing such an order." Kareem shook his head. "No," he said. "We're not." The pause. "You're asking us to stop doing something we don't control." Virectal's gaze shifted slightly. "To clarify." Kareem leaned forward just a fraction. "You think this is a program," he said. "It's not. It's not coming from a command center. It's not being distributed from a system. It's people." He gestured vaguely. Not at anything specific. At everything. Looking at what's around them and figuring out what to do with it. Virectal held his expression still. Because this was the part that could not be resolved. "You could restrict materials," he said. Kareem smiled faintly. "You'd have to restrict everything. Silence. Every tool. Every object. Every broken piece of something that used to be something else." He leaned back. "And even then," he added, "they'd still find a way." Virectal considered that. Carefully. Because it aligned with the data. Because it matched the reports. It was true. "This is not a weapon system," Kareem said. "It's how we think." There was the same conclusion. From a different direction. "You're asking us to stop thinking like that." Kareem shook his head again. "We can't." A small pause. "And even if we agreed." He looked at Virectal directly. "We wouldn't." The room held that. Not as a threat. Not as defiance. As reality. The clause was removed. The ceasefire held. Not because the war had been won. But because continuing it no longer made sense. Weeks later, Virectal stood in his command chamber. The map in front of him was stable now. Predictable again. Closer to it. But something had changed. Not in the data. In him. On his desk sat a small object. Unremarkable. Rough at the edges. He picked it up. Turned it over in his hands. It was a piece of human adhesive material. Recovered during post-engagement analysis. It did not belong in his environment. It served no defined function. It had no strategic value. And yet, he kept it. Because he understood something now. Not fully. Not completely. But enough. That object could become something else. Anything else. Depending on who held it. He set it back down. Looked at the map again. For the first time in his career, he was not looking for patterns. He was looking for possibilities. And he did not like what he saw. Far below, on a planet that was no longer classified as predictable, life resumed. Not as it had been. Not unchanged. But continuing. In a small yard, behind a modest house, a child sat on the ground surrounded by pieces of something that used to be a bicycle. Her name was Aisha. She was 8 years old. The bicycle had been taken apart. Not broken. Not damaged. Disassembled. Deliberately. The wheels were off. The chain removed. The frame split and rearranged. She worked in silence. Focused. Intent. Not because she had to. Because she wanted to. Her brother leaned against the fence, watching. "What are you making?" he asked. Aisha didn't look up. "I don't know yet," she said. And that was the answer. She picked up a piece of metal. Turned it. Adjusted it. Connected it to something else. Adjusted again. The process. Unstructured. Immediate. Alive. Eventually, it did something. Not perfectly. Not efficiently. But it worked. Her brother blinked. "That's weird," he said. Aisha smiled slightly. "I like it," she replied. She reached for another piece. Already thinking about how to make it better. Not because she had been taught. Not because she had been trained. Because she couldn't stop. And somewhere, in a report that would be read by people who would never meet her, a single conclusion had already been written. Not about war. Not about weapons. About something much simpler. And much more dangerous. When humans run out of tools, they do not stop. They begin. The sky above her was quiet now. Still normal. But that had never been the important part. The important part Had always been here. In the yard. In the hands. In the question. What can this become? And the answer was always the same. Anything.